Welcome to our podcast, Was Justice Delivered? Your go-to source for interesting, provocative, and in-depth legal analysis. I'm your host, Dror Bikel. Today's guest is Michael Polenberg. Michael is Vice President of Government Affairs at Safe Horizon. Safe Horizon is the nation's leading victim assistance organization, including victims of domestic violence. Drawing on 20 years of advocacy work, Michael is responsible for directing the agency's legislative and budget advocacy on both the state and local levels. Michael, welcome to our podcast.
Dror, thank you so much for having me today.
Michael, can you tell our listeners, what does Safe Horizon do?
Sure. Safe Horizon is the nation's largest nonprofit victim assistance organization. We help about 250,000 New Yorkers each year who've experienced violence or abuse, and we're based entirely within the 5 boroughs of New York City.
Can you tell us about your background, Michael? Because you have a very interesting background on how you got to work for Safe Horizon.
Sure. I graduated from college and started volunteering for UNICEF. This was back in 1990 because a friend knew about a volunteer opportunity there. While I volunteered there, I ended up getting a job, worked there for a bit, and I started, meanwhile, volunteering for Coalition for the Homeless on a mobile soup kitchen, vans that went out onto the streets each night to deliver meals. And in doing that work, I became more and more interested in how folks ended up on the street, what systems were working, what systems weren't working. I ended up leaving the job at UNICEF to work full-time at Coalition for the Homeless. And while I was there, we worked closely with the New York City Council on legislation to try to, again, address barriers to housing that homeless folks faced. I ended up then working for the city council, both for a council member and for the central staff for a number of years, and then went to another nonprofit and then came to Safe Horizon in 2008. When I was at Coalition for the Homeless, I used to refer people to Safe Horizon, so it felt very much like I was coming full circle. And I was really happy to have this opportunity to work for this very prestigious organization and to do advocacy on their behalf.
What specifically does Safe Horizon do? So how do you reach the survivors, and what does Safe Horizon do for the survivors?
Sure. Safe Horizon, we try to be as accessible as possible to anyone who might need help. We have 3 24-hour hotlines, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We are in every police station in the city, including the Special Victims Division precincts. So anyone who reports a crime in a police station can meet with an advocate. We're in almost every courthouse in the city. So somebody who's going to seek perhaps an order of protection or participating in a criminal trial can meet with Safe Horizon staff right there in the courthouse. We have community programs, legal services, mental health services. The list goes on and on. We have programs for homeless youth, programs for victims of human trafficking. We have ways that people can get to us not only by calling us, but through our web-based chat system. Wherever somebody is, and if they need help, we try to be there. We listen to what survivors tell us, and we try to chart a path with them towards safety and healing.
What sort of crimes do you see at Safe Horizon?
We work with victims of all crimes. Probably the largest subset is domestic violence. We work we have domestic violence shelters, we have a domestic violence law project, and other services for domestic violence survivors. But we also work with victims of sexual assault, of human trafficking, of child abuse, of community violence that happens on the streets. Whatever somebody needs, we're there for them.
So the shelter system, if somebody comes, there's an advocate from Safe Horizon, they meet a victim at the police station, how do you work with that survivor to get them to a shelter? What does that look like?
Sure. If somebody is asking for shelter, there's a couple of ways. Our domestic violence hotline has a real-time listing of all of the domestic violence shelters in the city and what vacancies they have, what size unit is available in what borough, and we try to match a survivor to the shelter, whether it's one operated by Safe Horizon, we operate 8 domestic violence shelters, or a shelter operated by one of our colleagues in the field. We try to make that link. It can be more difficult for some survivors. For example, a single adult survivor has a harder time generally finding a bed in a domestic violence shelter than a family does because the system isn't really configured for singles. It's a historical artifact that needs to be updated. But wherever we can, we try to make that match.
What about the legal assistance?
Sure.
As a lawyer, I'm in the courts all the time dealing with these issues. What sort of legal assistance do you provide both on the criminal and on the civil side when a victim of domestic violence, when you come into contact with victims of domestic violence?
So all of our legal services are civil. We have 3 areas where somebody can get legal assistance. The Domestic Violence Law Project, our attorneys practice in the family courts and state supreme courts and the integrated domestic violence courts. And they represent low-income victims of domestic violence who perhaps are seeking an order of protection through civil court, custody, visitation, child support, or in the case of state supreme court, a divorce. Our Immigration Law Project, we work with undocumented victims of any crime, whether that abuse happened in their home country and they're here seeking asylum, which of course is at the forefront of what New York City is encountering now with this huge migrant influx, or somebody who was here and victimized in New York, perhaps who was domestic violence or community violence. We work with them to advocate for some kind of immigration relief. It could be a U visa, it could be a VAWA self-petition, whatever it makes the most sense. And then our anti-trafficking program has a legal services component where they help survivors typically with T visas, which are special visas for trafficking survivors. So as a whole within Safe Horizon, our legal services are a fairly small component of what we do, but these programs are so important because, as you know, there are things that only a lawyer can do or only a lawyer is permitted to do. So to be able to have these services in-house and to be able to get referrals from our shelters, from our police programs, from our child advocacy centers is really, really important.
The attorneys are actually employed by Safe Horizon and then represent the survivors pro bono or without being paid. Is that how it works?
Well, they have a salary.
I'm sorry, the survivor doesn't pay the lawyer, obviously.
The survivor does not pay. Our Immigration Law Project, there are a sliding scale fees for certain services, typically for somebody who's already has some kind of status here in the country and is moving to the next level. We wouldn't charge a fee, for example, to somebody who needed help from one of our domestic violence shelters or one of our other programs. But, somebody perhaps has gotten some kind of relief and now wants to bring a family member over. There might be a modest fee associated with that.
You were in charge for a period of time of the law project, right?
Yes.
And what was your experience in terms of the courts? Did you feel that the courts were efficient in protecting the rights of survivors?
That's a great question. I think starting on the domestic violence law project side, family courts in New York City are, there's a lot of dysfunction. There are inconsistencies from judge to judge, from courthouse to courthouse. There can be uncertainty both for the survivor and the attorney about how a particular judge is going to rule on any particular day. The judges, I think, generally feel like family court is a way station on the way to something bigger and better, perhaps a judgeship in state supreme court. So there's not as much prestige as we would hope that judges would feel in family court, which means that judges may not be happy to be there and may be anxious to move on to the next thing in their lives. Family courts are often crowded. There's a lot of cases. It can be a little chaotic. And so there's definitely room for improvement there. I think in the immigration court, similarly, you have huge backlogs of cases that have only increased over the years. So whether somebody's trying to get a T visa or a U visa or whatever the case may be, it can be a challenge. You know, the interesting thing, and I'm always reminded of this, is in family court or Supreme Court or the Integrated Domestic Violence Court, our clients are going to the judge to ask for some kind of relief as a result of something that the abusive partner did. In the case of immigration court, the other side, the other party is, of course, the U.S. government. And our case is to say to the U.S. government why we think somebody should be allowed to stay in this country for some period of time. And the position of the U.S. government usually is an adversarial one until we can try to convince them otherwise.
The difference between Supreme Court, just so to clear it up for our listeners, and we've discussed this on different episodes as well, the family court has jurisdiction over issues relating to a family offense.
Right.
So you can immediately go to family court and get relief. If you're getting divorced, then Supreme Court would be more appropriate. And then you have the criminal courts, which you don't really deal with because the district attorney's prosecuting the case, right?
Right. The only exception to that is the integrated domestic violence courts, where there's a victim and who has both a family court case and is also has a prosecutor pursuing a criminal case. So the idea is, rather than have one judge hear the family court part and one judge hear the criminal court part, is you have one judge in one courtroom who hears both parts. So even though we're not the prosecutor, obviously, we work oftentimes alongside or in partnership with prosecutors to ensure the best outcome for our clients, even though they're handling the criminal case and we're handling the family court case.
A survivor in any of the boroughs of the city of New York can have an attorney from Safe Horizon represent them in one of these courts, Supreme Court, family court, integrated, right?
Yes.
Any of the courts.
To the extent that we have the capacity, yes.
So if you don't have the capacity, that means that you just don't have enough lawyers and the caseload is too big.
Exactly. And then one of our colleagues, there's a wonderful array of legal service providers in New York City. So one of our, esteemed colleagues from another organization will take the case.
So nobody would go unrepresented. You would just find another lawyer, if possible, another lawyer to represent them.
There are many clients who go unrepresented, especially in family court cases, either because they don't know how to find a lawyer, they don't know that they should have a lawyer, they think they made a decision that they don't want a lawyer. So there are a lot of clients who represent themselves pro se in these hearings. I think the outcomes generally are better if they have representation. And in immigration court, it's the same thing. There's no right to counsel in immigration court. So there are many folks who go through the gauntlet of immigration court with no lawyer. And again, the outcomes are far worse in those cases.
Yeah, I can assure our listeners, going to court without an attorney is a bad idea.
Yeah.
What about mental health services? Because that's obviously a big component for survivors of domestic violence.
Sure. And I think mental health work can come in different ways. Safe Horizon has a counseling center. It's a licensed Article 31 mental health clinic that we run. It's in downtown Brooklyn. We have some satellites in different locations in the city, and we provide a range of interventions and treatments for trauma survivors, whether it's a child, whether it's an adult, somebody who is victimized themselves, somebody who witnessed perhaps a shooting on the street. So we provide a range of interventions to really try to get to the heart of the trauma and to provide tools for that person's healing.
Do you stay in touch with some of the survivors after they've gone through, let's call it the system? In other words, they come to you, you help them, facilitate them going to a shelter, you facilitate and represent them in court. You provide mental health services to the survivor. And now after a period of time, that process is over and the survivor has moved on, do you keep in touch with them at all to see how they're doing?
It's a great question. I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to the survivor. If they want to stay in touch with us, we stay in touch. And there are folks that we have been in touch with for years and years after the crime happened. Perhaps somebody is in a support group and comes periodically or checks in. There's obviously no obligation on the part of a survivor to stay in touch. It's up to them. Some folks want to move on and put that chapter behind them, and other folks want to check in every so often and let us know how they're doing or ask questions. Oftentimes, someone like that might be a referral source for another survivor. I got help at Safe Horizon. They were there for me. They were responsive. Give them a ring. Visit one of their offices. So oftentimes former clients can be one of our best referral sources.
So you started, when you talked about your background, about how you were interested in how various systems work. So how effective is the Safe Horizon system in your view? I'm talking about on the ground level, because we're going to talk in a little bit about the government relations and some of the lobbying work you do and some of the government work you do. But on the ground level, in terms of from the initial intake through the end of the process, the court process is over, the treatment is over, the shelter process is over. How effective is this system?
I mean, effective is, one can interpret that many ways. I think we have a client-centered practice at Safe Horizon where the client is the lead in determining what the next steps are going to be. We don't tell clients what to do. We work with clients to chart a path to safety and healing that feels right for them. I think that we are effective in listening to what clients are telling us and working with them to develop a path forward. Somebody might call our hotline once and we never hear from them again, ever. And there could be a client, perhaps in one of our legal services programs or our mental health programs, where we're working with them for years. I mean, a custody case can take years. It's really, and then everything in between. So, how effective are we? We want to be there when somebody needs us. We want to have a non-judgmental, client-centered approach to every single person we work with, whether we speak with them once in their lives or whether we're going to work with them for years.
On the government, public relations, lobbying kind of category, what sort of actions does Safe Horizon get involved with?
Yeah, mostly budget advocacy and legislative advocacy. For budget advocacy, in good years, we're able to look at what Safe Horizon needs or what victims of crime need and try to get new funding to fund new initiatives. There was a good budget for many years that allowed us to have advocates in every police precinct in the city, to increase our staff at our child advocacy centers, which work with child victims of sexual abuse and severe physical abuse, and to start up other new programs. In bad budget years, we're playing defense. We're trying to stave off budget cuts. We're trying to make the case to lawmakers and to a mayor or a governor about why a program should stay intact. On the legislative front, there's so many bills and issues that are brought forward each year, and we try to focus on a select few that we think will have the greatest or the broadest impact on survivors and that seem to have a credible chance of moving forward. So for many years, we fought for the Child Victims Act, spent over a decade fighting for that bill. And that law, it's now law, was a statute of limitation reform bill for survivors of child sex abuse in New York State who otherwise faced a very narrow window in which to either pursue criminal charges or to try to sue their abuser in court. So the Child Victims Act extended the statute of limitations forward, both on the criminal side and on the civil side. And importantly, it opened up a 1-year window, which was later extended for another year because of COVID, to allow a time-barred survivor, somebody who was already over the age of 23 when the statute closed, to file a civil lawsuit against the person who harmed them or the institution that was negligent in stopping the abuse. So over 10,000 lawsuits were filed in the 2 years that the Child Victims Act window was open, which really speaks to both the prevalence of child sex abuse, but also the way in which that narrow statute of limitations, that if you didn't come forward by the age of 23, you had no chance, was so limiting that there were so many survivors who couldn't even name what happened to them or were otherwise intimidated or scared or too traumatized. And once that window opened, people were able to make a decision with their family, with an attorney, whether or not to file a civil lawsuit. We, of course, don't know what the outcome will be of all those cases. There will be plaintiffs who are successful. There'll be plaintiffs who aren't. But we have seen already huge, settlements and payouts made to survivors from largely institutions that were fighting the bill all along, and now we know why.
That's such a fascinating bill. And, the issue of statute of limitation is, it's one of those issues where what's fair is not necessarily just.
Right.
Statute of limitation is inherently unfair to the person who, is precluded or prevented from bringing a claim. That's not fair. Why should you be time barred? If something bad happened, you should be able to bring an action whenever that is. But you have
Right.
the other side, which should be able to move on with his or her life, and there should be some notice requirement on the case of somebody being accused. So you have these statute of limitations. So this is such an important bill. You worked on this yourself?
Yes.
And can you just...
Yes, it was a...
Yeah, go ahead. No, it was a huge bill. I remember it was...
Yeah, it was a game changer, and especially because the opposition in New York State was so strong. We had the Catholic Church fighting us, we had yeshivas fighting us, we had the Boy Scouts fighting us, and other institutions. So in New York State, there's no statute of limitations on certain crimes. There's, of course, no statute of limitations on murder. Doesn't matter how long ago it happened. If there's an ability to identify somebody who was a suspect in that case, of course, they're going to be charged. But also in New York State, there's no statute of limitations on several felony sex offenses: rape in the first degree, criminal sex act in the first degree, predatory sexual assault, and a handful of others. Because lawmakers recognize the severity of these crimes and the fact that if somebody was the victim of first-degree rape, the fact that the statute of limitations closed felt absurd, that somebody should still have the ability to bring charges forward. So I think that there's been a shift in New York and really around the country over the years as the prevalence of child sex abuse has become more well known. Look what happened while we were fighting for the Child Victims Act. The movie Spotlight came out and it won the Oscar for Best Picture for portraying the struggles of survivors to come to terms with the sexual abuse that happened by priests in Boston. There was a report from the state attorney general in Pennsylvania that showed the widespread sexual abuse in dioceses across the state. There was a Dr. Nassar case in Michigan where there was a doctor who abused hundreds of gymnasts, some of whom tried to report what happened. Others were too scared or didn't even know that what happened to them was necessarily a crime. So suddenly there was this sort of national awakening to the fact that child sex abuse is more prevalent than what most people probably think.
And they were our Olympic heroes. These women that were abused by Nassar were our gold medalists. They're our heroes.
That's right. Their courage, their bravery to face Dr. Nassar in court, it's unbelievable.
It was incredible.
What they did. And not only what they did for their own cases, but what message that sent across the country, including here in New York. So there were, lawmakers who had dug in opposition to the Child Victims Act because they thought it would have an adverse impact on the church or on yeshivas or on the Boy Scouts or other institutions. They became more cognizant of the fact that, again, child sex abuse happens more than they think. And the idea that somebody could come forward and report something is a lot harder than it seems on paper. And that perhaps 23 is an artificially low age for somebody to be able to come forward. The legislature ended up changing hands. The state Senate went from Republican to Democrat in 2019, and the bill passed within the first month of session, and every Republican state senator voted for it, even those who had opposed the bill in the past, again, because they recognized that something had to change, that it just wasn't right. It wasn't fair or just for child sex abuse survivors to know that abusers can run out the clock.
What sort of bills have you been working on in the area of domestic violence?
Sure. There's a couple of bills. One of the bills that comes to mind is a bill that passed the Assembly and the Senate this past spring called the Fair Access to Victim Compensation Bill. And this is a little convoluted, but I'll try to make it make sense here. In New York State, if you're the victim of crime, you can get expenses that you incurred as the result of a crime. You can get those expenses reimbursed by the New York State Office of Victim Services, which draws mostly on federal funds to reimburse survivors. So whether it's a victim of an assault or domestic violence or whatever crime it is, if there's expenses that other entities aren't paying for, that insurance won't pay for example, then you can go to the Office of Victim Services and ask for reimbursement. However, you need to have a police report that accompanies your application. And the police report says, like all police reports would say, on this street corner or this time and this place, the victim claimed that this happened. This is our, investigating such and such. And the Office of Victim Services would look at this police report and look at the other paperwork that the survivor submitted and make a decision about whether or not to issue reimbursement. What we know, of course, is that not everybody goes to the police. We have folks in our domestic violence shelters who may never have gone to the police. Instead, they came to shelter. We have survivors who go to civil court to file for an order of protection who never called the police, and they're choosing to go through the civil side instead. There are survivors who perhaps seek counseling or look for safety planning or any of the other paths that survivors choose that never involve the police, never involve district attorneys. There's no criminal case. And aren't those survivors still... Yeah.
I'm just going to step in, Michael. From what my experience, one reason, I can give two reasons why people don't call the police. I mean, listeners may think to themselves, why, if you're a victim, why wouldn't you call law enforcement? Well, one reason is you could be scared of the police.
That's right.
And some people have fears based upon their own experiences, and they're just scared. Another reason is you don't want the police coming to your home when you have children because it's scary for your children to have law enforcement there with guns, and it's scary. And for people in a higher socioeconomic status, you don't want the press involved. And, having law enforcement and even the district attorney involved can affect somebody's employment. If they're arrested or if they're the subject of an order of protection, that can affect their employment. There's registries and there are employment contracts and doctors and lawyers and people in finance, licensure issues. If you have been found to perpetrate acts of domestic violence, that can really affect your ability to earn, and that effect could affect child support.
That's right.
So, there's a lot of reasons why people don't want to go to the police. It may seem self-evident that people should, but there's a lot of reasons why they don't.
It can also make things a lot worse for that survivor when the police are called, especially, even maybe there's an arrest, maybe the person spends a day or two at Rikers Island and then is out, or maybe they're not incarcerated at all, and now the survivor has to deal with the consequences of that person who was abusive to begin with, who's now angrier perhaps than they were before. So there's all sorts of reasons why, there's issues of race, there's issues of class, why somebody might not want to involve the police. So we got a law passed in Albany that would allow that survivor to not, in lieu of a police report, they could get a letter, for example, from Safe Horizon, that the person came in, they stated that this happened, we are attaching that attestation or that letter to our application. And we're really excited that the law passed. I think it's going to be really important for domestic violence survivors and survivors of other crimes. who, for any number of reasons, didn't want to involve the police. It now allows them to apply. It doesn't guarantee reimbursement. It just means that they can get that application in the front door.
Can you describe for us the mechanics? This always fascinates me for those that are involved in government relations. The mechanics and the work and the time that it takes to get a bill like that passed. Like, what do you do day to day to push something like that through?
On that bill, I think there was a bias that a little bit of what you hinted at earlier. Why wouldn't you call the police? Why wouldn't you go to law enforcement? You mean anybody can just write a letter saying that something happened? They somehow need the official seal of a police officer. So we had to fight through some of that. And
how do you do that? How do you fight through that?
We have conversations with lawmakers about, let's talk about what, for example, the state of New York does. The state of New York funds our domestic violence shelters, shelter for somebody, case management. They're funding our staff. They're funding the building without anyone ever having to go to the police, without any police reports whatsoever. We provide mental health services to victims of all sorts of crime based entirely on what they tell us. They come in, they tell us that they're a victim of a crime where they witnessed something that happened. They're dealing with traumatic symptoms. They're having trouble sleeping. They're having trouble catching their breath. And we provide services to them with no police reports, no official seal from, an officer in a precinct. So the state of New York already pays us to provide a range of services to survivors of domestic violence and other crimes with no quote-unquote proof from a police officer that a crime took place. So why is it different for the matter of reimbursement for modest expenses or significant expenses perhaps that a survivor incurred? Why suddenly on this one thing do we need the imprint of a police report to verify that something happened?
Well, I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a minute because I think one reason may be that it is a crime to lie to law enforcement. If you give false statements to the police, that can subject somebody to prosecution potentially, right? So there's a level of credibility there that you don't have when somebody goes to Safe Horizon and says the same thing, right?
Yeah, I don't know how many people make up stories to police officers for the sake of trying to get reimbursement from the State Office of Victim Services. And it should be clear, it's reimbursement. It means that you already laid out money or you incurred expenses. This is not just, I'm a victim of a crime, hand me $5,000. This is reimbursement for expenses that you incurred. So the idea that somebody would lie to law enforcement or make up a story to a police officer for the sake of this, it's not something we've seen.
And so then you talk to so you schedule meetings with the lawmakers. I'm trying to just get a hold of the mechanics. You schedule a lawmaker, either side of the aisle, meeting, and then you go in, I assume you personally and your team goes in, and you give them a presentation, you have conversations with them.
Yeah.
How does it work?
We got the Adult Survivors Act passed in 2022, and that took many years. It was similar to the Child Victims Act in that it created a 1-year look-back window for an individual who was sexually assaulted as an adult but wasn't able to file a civil lawsuit before the statute of limitations ran out. And we would have mostly survivors. This was all, of course, right when COVID hit, so we were doing virtual meetings on Zoom with lawmakers, which is a weird new way of doing advocacy, but we've all had to adjust. And mostly it would be survivors talking about what happened to them and the reasons why they weren't able to come forward to even tell somebody. We had survivors who did come forward and spoke to the police and spoke to district attorneys, but cases weren't prosecuted. They weren't believed. So the ability for these survivors to be able to file a civil lawsuit against people or institutions was really important. And we, again, had to fight through lawmakers who had assumptions that, you're with the Child Victims Act was kids. We get it. They couldn't have come forward, but these are adults. They should have come forward. They should have known. We're talking about grown-ups here. Why do we need to create this special 1-year look-back window? And we would tell lawmakers over and over on Zoom calls, and then when we moved to some in-person, when we travel to Albany and speak at press conferences and write op-eds, that, trauma takes time. It can be very difficult, and it can be shameful, and it can be embarrassing, and it can be painful for a survivor to come forward and say that they were sexually assaulted. We should allow people the time they need to be able to pursue whatever action they need in the court. And of course, it's a 1-year window. It's not, they don't have forever. They have until November of this year, but at least it's some opportunity.
Did you have survivors speak to lawmakers or testify?
Absolutely.
Testify before the legislature? Did that happen?
We can't do any bill in Albany if not for the voices of survivors who are at the heart of this work. I'd like to think I'm a credible voice on these matters, but the truth is that lawmakers much prefer to hear from those most directly impacted. So yes, we had huge coalitions of survivors who would, again, either on a Zoom call or up in Albany, meet with lawmakers, tell them their stories, which, by the way, is not easy to do. And to tell their story over and over, with the Child Victims Act, people were telling their stories for over a decade, and that takes a toll. And there were survivors who said, I can't do this anymore. It's too painful for me to relive these moments. And others who said, we're going to keep doing this, we're going to keep fighting. And then, of course, it's so cathartic when the bill finally passes.
Do you have an example or two of the story of a survivor on this bill that came to a lawmaker and told his or her story that was just so compelling?
There were survivors we worked with who the person who abused them also employed them or had an ability to influence their employment. And so the fact that they were a very young adult, we're talking about 18 or 19 perhaps, and were sexually abused by somebody who could make or break them in industries, and the fear and the trauma and, oh my God, did this really happen to me? And maybe it was this and maybe it won't happen again. And then finding out that they perhaps did it to other people. There were survivors that we worked with who were sexually assaulted by an obstetrician who would sexually abuse patients, hundreds and hundreds of patients. And there were women who thought, oh my God, what did he just do? Is that normal? Is that what should happen during a pregnancy exam? That felt more invasive than it should have. But maybe I'm the only person.
That's like the Larry Nassar case.
Yeah, and then you find out that, oh my God, I'm not alone in this, that hundreds and hundreds of people were abused by this same person. And some of these folks went to the police and met with district attorneys who, at the end of the day, decided not to press charges. And now, in the case of a doctor here in Manhattan, a guy named Robert Haddon, he is being prosecuted and he's being charged. So it's all of these kinds of cases.
Is there anything in the pipeline now in the area of domestic violence that you're working on?
One of the biggest issues, it goes back to funding. And I think victim service providers in New York and around the country are facing a significant decrease in federal funding that supports victim service providers. There's something called the Victims of Crime Act, otherwise known as VOCA, which passed many years ago, and it created, amongst other things, something called the Crime Victims Fund. And the Crime Victims Fund is comprised of money that corporations have to pay as part of a penalty in a criminal prosecution brought by U.S. attorneys across the country. So Company A is prosecuted, and as part of their penalty, they have to pay, make up a number, $10 million. And that goes into the Crime Victims Fund, which then goes to help victim service providers all across the country. And for many years, that pot was relatively robust. And, it would ebb and flow a little bit, but it was relatively robust. So it meant that providers who offered services to crime victims could depend on this pot of funding to sustain their work. And what's happened over the years has been a decrease in white-collar prosecutions and fewer dollars going into this fund, while everyone's expenses have only gone up as service providers for cost of staff, services. So I think we are all facing the need to really focus on how to shore up funding for this pot of funding.
Where does Safe Horizon get its funding from?
Yeah, it's a mix. We have city funding from the mayor, from the city council. We have state funding, including a little bit from the state legislature. We have federal funding, and then we raise private money from foundations or from individuals. Most of our funding is public.
How many people does Safe Horizon employ?
I think we're at about 800 plus staff currently. And again, we're in, well over 100 locations throughout New York City.
How many survivors do you work with on a regular basis?
About 250,000 people.
Wow.
These are children and adults. Yeah, it's a lot. Again, 3 24-hour hotlines, 8 domestic violence shelters, 5 child advocacy centers. We're in almost every court. We're in all 86 police precincts plus the special victims precincts. It's a lot.
Wow. What would you say to lawmakers generally, when it comes to passing bills to help victims of domestic violence?
I think it's to really listen to what survivors are asking for. I think there are still lawmakers who think that all survivors are asking for are bills that increase criminal penalties, that make something, a misdemeanor to a felony, or, so on and so forth. And I think bills like that can be important, but it's often not always what survivors are asking for. What can we do to really ensure paths to safety and healing? There needs to be a huge investment in affordable housing, especially in New York City. It's one of the most pressing needs that our clients have. So a little bit more focus on these issues.
And on behalf of Safe Horizon, what would you say to somebody who may be listening to this episode who is a victim of domestic violence and who is so scared but really wants to take the next step? What would you say to them?
The first thing I'd say is you're not alone. Oftentimes, victims of domestic violence or other crimes think that what happened to them hasn't happened to somebody else. And we're always available. Our hotlines are available. You can reach us on our website at safehorizon.org. When you feel the time is right to look for help, give us a ring. We'll work with you in a way that makes sense. We won't pressure you to make a decision you don't want to make. And we'll try to do what's right for you and for your family.
Michael, thank you so much for participating in this episode. This has been such a fascinating discussion. I tip my hat to you. The work you're doing and the success that you have had on behalf of victims at the legislature has really changed lives. And it's such important work. And I urge all of our listeners to support Safe Horizon. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Dror. I'm really happy we did this.
Michael, that was fabulous. Oh my God.